I'm sure you don't want to be here tonight, but somehow you knew that it was important to look at your grief and deal with your pain. So I hope that you take home some nugget tonight, and it will help you on your grief journey. So I don't know if you realize this or not, but I'm sure you do, that grief is universal. Grief is universal, but your grief experience is extremely unique. It's unique as you, it's unique as your parent or parents, and it must be mourned. For the purposes of tonight, I'm going to use the word parent, and it's going to refer to biological parent, adoptive parent, parent by circumstance, or whomever is in your life that you consider a parent. Okay? So this relationship is a special kind of a loss, and we are affected. Even as adults, we're affected when they die. And we must also grieve the relationship. We have to grieve the perfect relationship, the perfect parental relationship, all the way to the not so perfect parental relationship. And many people think that if you did not have the perfect parental relationship, the grief process is easier. But I will tell you that it's more complicated, it's more complex, but it still needs to be grieved. But we not only grieve and mourn their absence, we grieve and mourn so many other losses. They're called symbolic losses, and we're going to talk about that tonight as well. So this presentation it's kind of a bird's eye view of grief, and then specifically parental grief. I obviously can't speak to everyone's unique relationship and loss experience in the audience here. So if there's anything that you'd like to know a little bit further about your own grief experience, come and talk to me, or certainly book an appointment with me if you think that might be helpful. And while it's a really important grief experience to acknowledge, it's a very misunderstood grief experience. It's not given the same respect. And certainly not in our society, it's not given the same type, you may not be given the same type of support, because it's a grief experience that it's not respected. It's like we place grief experiences on a hierarchy, depending on who it was that died. And when you lose your parent in adulthood, it's almost like it's insignificant. But I want you to know it is significant. It's very significant, because after all, our parents are our first protectors, our advocates, and friends. They're the first people we come to know. And that's all based on a very important concept called attachment. You wouldn't be here mourning their death if you weren't attached to them. And this is not a business relationship we're talking about. We're talking about a relationship of the heart. So many of our behaviors and our thoughts and our experiences that follow the death of our parent might not make sense. We'll chat about that later. But love doesn't always make sense, does it? We're driven by emotions. And the grief that follows their death is really an example of separation anxiety. So think about the infant. Attaches to their primary caregiver, hopefully in a good, healthy relationship, they get their needs met. They start to feel secure in their world. They learn how to modulate their emotions. They learn how to respond in the world. And they use that very important relationship as a blueprint or a template for relationships that we're going to have in the future. That's why attachment theory is very significant. A lot of research has been put into attachment theory. And so now going back to that infant, when they're separated from their primary caregiver, even if it's just for an hour or an evening, there's a response. And we call that separation anxiety. So what we're all experiencing is the adult form of separation anxiety. So we're not being childish when we go through the grief experience after our parent has died. But what we're doing is we're honoring a very biological instinct, because they were the first people that we attached to. It's very biologically, instinctively based. Now, you may not need them as a young child might need them, but again, grief doesn't make sense. It just is. So I'd like this evening to be as interactive as possible. While it's not a support group, feel free to ask me any questions, stop me, ask me for clarification. I may not be able to speak to your specific experience, in which case come and see me after the session. But if you need any clarification along the way, don't hesitate, please. So I was supposed to be ready when my mother died in 2008 from metastatic breast cancer. I was supposed to be ready to say goodbye. After all, she was in her 70s and had been ill for quite some time. I was not a child or even a young adult. At my age, I was supposed to be ready, but I was not. We're never, ever ready. This part of us is never, ever ready. We may logically understand, especially if we have elderly parents, or if they've been ill, or both, but we never quite, our intellect, are not quite ready on a heart level. So what is this we're talking about? What are we ready for? What are you all experiencing in this room? Well, we're experiencing a grief reaction. We're experiencing separation anxiety. This is not something we snap out of. This is not something we talk ourselves out of. This is not something we get over. But it's something that we have to experience because it's based on attachment. So it's very complex, it's unique, it's both, as I said, highly personal, but also very universal experience. And we use the word grief to actually describe separation from anything that we desire. I have grief because I didn't get the job that I wanted. I experience grief when my last child leaves the nest. Tonight it's going to be specific, though, the grief reaction to a permanent loss, which is through death. And what grief does is not only affect us emotionally, but it affects us actually in 5 domains. And because we don't talk about this in our culture, we're not open about grief, most likely what you're experiencing is very normal given the fact that a parent has died. But because we don't talk about it, we're not schooled in it, we're not knowledgeable, we're very surprised, and we think that only we're experiencing that there's something wrong with us. So it affects us physically, because grief is stress. And where do we hold our stress? We hold it in our bodies. So we have sleep disturbances, eating possibly, headaches, backaches. Perhaps if you're struggling with a chronic condition, it could be exacerbated. Breakout in hives. Your body's telling you something needs to be looked at. Now, you wouldn't ignore a physical ailment or any other sign under any other condition. So we shouldn't ignore what our body's telling us in grief, because it is very much connected. And I always tell my clients that soon after a death, or as soon as possible after any type of death, to see your family physician and get a baseline exam done. Grief also affects us cognitively. We don't have bandwidth when we're in acute grief for much anything else, mental bandwidth. So we might have difficulty focusing, remembering, retaining new information. We could be unfocused. And that's not you losing control of your mind. That's just the fact that grief is occupying that space. And it's really not that important. It affects us socially as well. You might find you don't get the support that you expected. You might be very surprised at comments people make to you, especially in this type of death, with this type of death. You might be disappointed in people. By the same token, be open to people who come into your life, whom you can bond with over this pain. And then it also has the potential to affect us on what we call a spiritual level. Not religious, but in terms of, now what? Now where do I go? I feel like I have no purpose. Maybe you were a caregiver of that parent. Or you relied on that parent for support, emotional support. And you wonder now, what is the meaning and purpose in your life? You might explore your religious beliefs if you belong to a faith community, and that's all right. So it affects us on 5 realms, not only emotionally. So let's have a look at the next slide. And it is intentionally intended to kind of come at you, because that's what grief is like, right? Anybody experienced any of these? Can you identify yourself up there? Right? Did you think you were maybe going crazy? Right? Did you maybe judge yourself if you felt a little resentment or jealousy? Or maybe you felt some relief because they were very ill. Well, everything up there is normal when you're acutely grieving. With the exception of wanting to cause harm to yourself or anyone else, any of that is normal. Any questions about that? Anything that I might have missed that you've experienced and are willing to share? Okay. So I want to clarify some things. Grief will come in waves. That's why, hence the other slide, things coming at you, slowly, quickly, without you expecting it, from nowhere, from behind, from all over. And guess what? You don't have any control of it at the beginning. And it's best that you try not to control it, but to learn how to manage it. Because grief is trying to get your attention so you process it. And so you have to make room. You have to let go of some things at the beginning of the grief process to make room for the grief, for all of those symptoms, so that they do soften. So it's going to come more like waves, not in stages. And believe me, there isn't only 5 if we were to use the stages concept. You don't have to experience all those symptoms, just like when you get a prescription from your pharmacist and they give you that warning list. You don't have to tick them all off. But if you experience any of those symptoms or side effects, it's normal. So grief is going to come in waves, up and down. Because it's not stage-like, it's very unpredictable. It can be overwhelming. Those waves can pull you under sometimes, and that's okay. It can pull you under for 1 day, or 1 hour, or 2 days. That's okay. As long as you keep putting one foot in front of the other, it doesn't have to be a big step. And it is normal. Again, think of that infant, think of that child who's separated from their caregiver. It's about survival for that child, is it not? It's about survival. Who's going to look after me now? And one of the things I think the general public doesn't understand, aside from pain and sadness and all those other feelings, anxiety is also a very big part of the grief process. Because on a very deep biological level, somehow the world doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel safe. Your foundation has been shaken. There is no end point. Now, that doesn't mean you're always going to feel the way you're feeling today. But if there was an end point, that would mean that you've stopped loving. Well, we don't ever stop loving people that have died, that have been important to us, that we've attached to. But it softens. It becomes more manageable to carry. You kind of get you're not in quicksand anymore. You're feeling a little bit more firmer ground under your feet. You're then able, while grief takes on a more proportionate size in your life, you're then able to bring in other things into your life. But the grief is always there. We'll always dance with our grief. But hopefully we won't be struggling with our grief. It won't be holding us captive, as you may feel it is right now. You can't do this alone. Even coming here tonight, you're telling me that you sort of understand this. If your car needed to be fixed, unless you're a mechanic, you'd take it to the garage. If you had a toothache, you'd go to a dentist. Why is it that when we struggle with our emotions, that we have a difficult time asking for help? Why is that seen as a failure or a weakness? It's actually a sign of strength. I remember when my daughter was younger, I attended, all the parenting classes and parenting seminars. And one speaker in particular used to say, well, I love this, and it used to be the Kubota Club. Well, she loved having lots of parents attend. She said the ones that weren't there probably needed to attend. So you are actually doing a courageous thing by coming here or by tuning in remotely. Also understand from a social realm, no one is going to be able to support you perfectly because we're not perfect. So it's going to be up to you to try to determine who's there for you, who'll walk with you through this process. Try to stay away from those people who try to push and pull you through the process, won't talk about your parent, minimize it. So if somebody happens to say something hurtful like, well, they lived a good life, as Dr. Alan Wolfed would recommend you respond, true, but not helpful. True, but not helpful. They're not in pain anymore. True, but not helpful. So then you remember that person. You don't cut them out of your life. But you're thinking, maybe this is not the person that I want to spend more time with right now. They're trying to minimize my grief. They're trying to help me to get over it, or push me to get over it. One of the most important things is to learn to surrender to your pain. We don't have breakdowns in grief, we have breakthroughs. Because when I hear a client of mine says, I had a breakdown last week, I want to know all about it, and then I say, good for you. That means you allowed grief to take control. That's how it lessens its grip on you. I know it seems counterintuitive because our society is all about keeping things in control. And what we try to do with grief, because it's messy, right? It's like that child that colors outside the lines. We try to put a nice, perfect frame around a messy picture. And we'll lose that battle. So surrender to the grief process. Do what you have to do, which we'll talk about, but surrender to the pain. Understand you've earned it because of your attachment. What does it mean? Why always precedes how? Why did he die? Why did she die? Why me? Ask those questions if that's part of your grief experience. Explore it. And then we have to move on to how do I get through this? In our culture, we want to put the cart before the horse. How do I get through it? Well, first we have to process it by asking those questions. Why? Any questions about that? Any comments? Anything you want me to review? Repeat? Anything? Yes, hi.
Hi. I think when talking with friends at my age now, we're starting to lose our parents in our 50s. So if they haven't lost their parents yet, that's what they do. They try to push you through it when they haven't experienced. When I talk to people that have, they kind of understand a little bit more. So I think that's a defense mechanism for people that haven't experienced it yet. So, and it's harder sometimes to talk to people that haven't experienced it. But that's what I find with my friends right now.
With your experience. So just for the people who are watching remotely, probably didn't pick that up. This lady talked about her experience that her peers, if they haven't lost a parent as yet, she finds that their response is maybe to minimize it because they haven't walked the path yet. Whereas
Fearful to walk that path, they're afraid.
And she just added they're fearful, and I was just going to add that perfect. That if I minimize it, if I minimize your pain, it's not that bad, then maybe it won't be that bad for me. And that's also another reason why our culture wants to move you through, because we're not comfortable with pain. We don't want to face our parents' mortality we don't want to face our own mortality. So let's pack it all up, especially after a funeral. Put it on a shelf and get on with life. Or keep busy. So that was very intuitive of you to understand that. And not be affected by it in a negative way. I will though add that even someone who's lost a parent but haven't done their grief work, you could be surprised at their responses, which is, hey, I got over it, so can you. But I'll almost reassure you that their grief is following them. And they'll continue to live in the shadows of that grief. I'd like you to live in the memory and the love of that parent, not in the shadows of grief of that parent. So, how do I get through this? How do I deal with the waves? Well, it's very simple. But it doesn't happen a lot, unfortunately. Well, I get through this by doing something we call mourning, which is grief work. That's when I take what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, and give it voice outside of myself. It's grief gone public. I cry my story, I tell my story, I write my story, I work out my story, I get it out instead of keeping it in. But if I keep it in, then I don't have to feel it, or so we think, or so we tell ourselves. So your tears, if you are a crier, your tears are a sign of mourning. If you find somebody who listened to your story and you tell your story, then that's mourning. If you're an artist and you have the desire and the inclination, paint out your story, paint out your moods, use music. Externalize it in some way and in some form so that the pain doesn't stay with you. The resentment, the jealousy, the anger doesn't stay inside you. That's how we get through this process. We understand it's normal. We let it control us at the beginning, and we do our grief work. So when you're tired, rest your body. If you feel like crying, take a grief break. If you want to be by yourself for a little while, that's okay. And we absolutely need to do our grief work to reconcile it. I was in my 40s when my mom died. And as I'm nearing her age when she died, it doesn't seem so old now anymore. And I was doing this work then. And I knew that iceberg was there and I was heading towards it. But I couldn't do anything about it. I knew that I would experience grief. But I couldn't go around it, I couldn't go under it, I couldn't go over it. But I also knew it was normal and it was okay. So I couldn't intellectualize myself out of the grief. I had to experience it. But when I experienced it, I didn't put additional stress on myself. I understood what I was going through, and I allowed the process to play out. But it's very difficult to mourn, and it's very difficult to find people to support you in your mourning, because we really are a mourning avoiding culture. Don't talk about it, don't feel. Don't trust anyone when you want to share. Keep it to yourself. And yet your instincts are telling you, you need to reach out to someone. You want to talk, you want to cry. You want to beat the pillow up. And yet we've internalized those messages from our mourning avoiding culture. Especially with a parental death. Because we should expect it. And then that diminishes your experience and your relationship. And don't let anyone write your grief narrative. So at the beginning of this evening, I talked about how grief is universal, but it's so unique. So these are the things that are going to affect your particular experience after the death of your parent or parents. These are the things I'm going to want to know in order to help you get through it. Who was this person? What kind of relationship did you have with them? Was it the perfect parental relationship? You know what? It's okay to say they weren't perfect. But they did the best they could. What were the circumstances surrounding the death? Was it quick? Was it expected? My mom died 11 days after a cancer diagnosis. We got her home for 1 day. So in a lot of ways, it was experienced like a sudden death. So what about your support system? What about your belief system? And I don't necessarily mean religion. What about your family belief system? What about your family dynamics? That's all going to affect your unique experience. And understand that if you've got siblings, and while you all have experienced the death of the same parent, your experience, your grief experience is going to be different. So be aware of that, because I think subconsciously we think if we're all grieving the same person, our experience should be the same or similar. And that's not necessarily true. Because when they were alive, we had different relationships with them based on our unique personality. So have an awareness of that. Try not to let anybody else your siblings impose their experience on you, and similarly, don't expect your sibs to have the same relationship. Have you got any other stressors going on in your life? Are you dealing with financial issues or chronic physical health problems or mental health problems? What are your fragilities? What are your vulnerabilities? I need to know that, because this is stressful. And what's really important is, what kind of person are you? What's your unique personality? While you may be profoundly sad, are you basically an optimistic person? Do you see the glass half empty or half full? So while you're incredibly profoundly sad now, can you still list things that you're grateful for? Because those two things are compatible. Happy and sad are not compatible. You can't have both at the same time. Can't look at both sides of the same coin. And you should not force yourself to be happy if you're filled with sad. So we literally, by our mourning, we pour out the sad. And then naturally our happy comes back. Because again, many times we want to put the cart before the horse. I'm a happy person. I used to be a happy person, and I'm not anymore. Well, no, you're sad right now. That's your experience. But ultimately, you're an optimistic person, if that's the case. So examine yourself. How do you look at life? Do you understand that life isn't fair? Do you understand that life can be good? Set your intention also to heal. Be very aware of any of these what we call mourning avoiding behaviors. And once again, our culture is going to want to move you through the grief process quickly because they want you back the way you were. So, if you still have a parent, be aware of compulsively caregiving. You still have to care for yourself. How you doing? I'm doing fine. I'm keeping busy. Right? I'm keeping busy. That's make work, really. That's putting it aside. That's distracting. Yes, you may have to go to work. The bills still need to be paid. The garbage still needs to be taken out. Kids and grandkids still need to be looked after. But this is also something that needs to be attended to. We can't busy ourselves out of grief. It isn't going to work. Retail therapy. Buy. Makes me happy. Fills that hole. Fills that space. What about not talking about your loved one, your parent? Oh, I see there's a misprint there. It should be refusing to or not talking about your parent. Or using substances, misusing substances to take the edge off, to try to fall asleep because your mind's going. You can't turn it off. But you kept busy all day. But you can't relax enough to fall into sleep. Or any kind of process behaviors, process addictions. Gambling, renovating, traveling, moving, anything like that, that we do out of urgency is really not productive, and it's not a solution to our grief process. It has to be felt, and it has to be externalized and released. Otherwise, you will carry it with you. An integrated grief means that the death of your parent will take on a proportionately appropriate place in your life story. It won't be the focus, as it might be now. And you'll get to a place where you can talk about them more so with a smile than a tear. Where now you're mourning their absence, when you do your mourning, when you do your grief work, it will then change to being appreciative of their presence. Will you miss them? Yes. Yes, you will. But it'll be woven into your life. It'll be integrated into your life. Any questions about that? Comments? No? Okay. So, we're just going to take a very brief break. Maybe just get up and stretch. Maybe check in. Check in with yourself right now. How are you feeling? Where are your emotions or your thoughts? How's your breathing? Is it rapid? Are you slow? Are you holding any tension anywhere? Take a few deep breaths. Maybe get up and stretch. We'll take 5 minutes. And I want you to maybe even reflect on this image and think of a sweet memory. And if your body needs to shed some tears, let it. It's okay. So let's just take a stretch break for 5 minutes, okay? to get going. Is anyone willing to share a special memory? Funny one?
All like your mom's good china and crystal this week was Thanksgiving weekend.
Wonderful. So I'm going to repeat that. This lady used all of her mom's good china and crystal for Thanksgiving weekend. How appropriate, right? How appropriate is that?
I don't know.
No. It's a rhetorical question. It's very appropriate. Good morning behavior, right? While it may have made you sad that she wasn't there, that was a connection to her. Absolutely. What made you? Can I ask you, what made you choose to use her?
I can't stop crying.
You will if you keep talking about it.
Well, everyone was at my house, so I had to use it for them.
No, there was something in you that made you use it.
She would have been proud of that.
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat it for the people remotely, that this guest here talked about she used it for the family because all the family was there, and I challenged her a bit and I said, are you sure there wasn't anything else why you were drawn to doing it? And she said, yeah, she would have been proud that we used her china.
Like she's like my mom.
What's that?
She's like my mom, our mother most.
Aha. Now Michelle's taking over. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. Yeah.
And Dad would have wanted it too, because we lost both in a very, very short period of time.
So Michelle and her sister are here, and they lost both parents in a very short period of time. Yeah. So that's a sweet memory. And now it's bringing tears. But if you keep doing your grief work in your mourning, you'll be able to smile when you tell us that story. The first Thanksgiving, the first family gathering after her death, we used her china. I'll share with you a little story. My mother she was a great cook. She used to make green beans almondine, but from a recipe that was passed on by her grandmother, my great-grandmother. And unfortunately, I really never learned how to make it, although I know I've been told by clients it's really easy, but not her recipe. Because she was such a good cook, I just never bothered. And I regretted that after she died. But my father's a really good cook. And so now, since her death, he makes the green beans. He makes the green beans almondine, and that has now become a tradition in our family. But it's not sad. It's sweet. It's a sweet memory. It's painful maybe for the first little while. But if you keep doing your grief work, I can't say I can guarantee, but the likelihood that those memories, because those memories don't change, right? The china and the crystal doesn't change. It's how we see it and how we experience those memories. And you're filled with sad right now because you're missing them intensely. But the memories remain the same. It's how we experience the memories. Anybody else? Okay. Want to keep it private? That's okay. Did anyone not feel like marking Thanksgiving this year? I just see a lot of nods. Did you?
I haven't wanted to do anything for 9 months, so.
You haven't wanted to do anything for how long?
It's been 9 months.
9 months, okay. So this lady said she hasn't wanted to do anything for 9 months. So motivation really low.
Yeah.
Really, really low. Energy probably really low
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. Too much of an effort. Okay.
Until my oldest says, no, Mom, he wouldn't want you sitting around doing nothing. Which he's right.
Okay. So one of the things to understand is that, especially during the first year, and I be aware that nothing magical happens after the year, okay? And I'll explain that in a moment. But especially after the first year, where we go through the usual firsts, it's okay to do things halfway. It's okay to do things differently. It's okay if you didn't want to use mom's china. If you decided to order takeout and eat on paper plates. What is more important from a mental health perspective is that you mark these days. You're not celebrating necessarily, but you mark them. Your heart may not be in it, but you mark it, you recognize it. Maybe you have a potluck. Maybe you decide to do something easier. Maybe you decide just to light candles. Order a pizza, but it has to be marked because there'll be another Thanksgiving and another Thanksgiving. So even when you're invited out, you don't have to go from beginning to end. You can ask your host if it's okay to leave when you've hit your tolerances. So you have my permission to do things a little differently this year, for the next little while, for as long as you need to, as long as you're acutely grieving. So we have talked about this, that it's a very misunderstood death because it is a very common death. Again, because we think very linearly, we expect our parents who are older than us to predecease us. So it's expected. But our heart takes much longer to catch up to our heads. And usually, our relationship with our parents in adulthood doesn't normally deprive us of a primary relationship.
Can you say that again?
Sure.
What you're saying.
Usually we've differentiated from our parents. We either have our own families, own children, a group of friends that become our primary relationship. So it doesn't deprive us of a primary relationship as adults. Very different when you're a child, very different when you're an infant, because you're relying on that parent as your caregiver, your protector. But in adulthood, it doesn't deprive you of a primary source of support. And so because of that, again, it's minimized in terms of the emotional effect it has on you. And so those unrealistic societal expectations are there, and then we've internalized it. Well, I should have expected it. You know, after all, they were however old. So while you can't do anything about anybody else's support or lack of support, you can be honest with yourself in terms of, are you internalizing and putting more pressure on yourself and not allowing yourself to fully experience this grief? Because you do have control over that. Give yourself permission to mourn this fully, because it comes out of attachment. It's cultural fiction that parental death is an incidental experience of adult life. No, it's not. Again, while we may not be relying on them financially or totally emotionally, it's a significant life transition and milestone in our lives. So give yourself permission to grieve it as such. So here are some things that can be quite common as an adult when you've experienced a death. Your emotions might surprise you. They might overwhelm you. You know, why am I crying when I'm setting the table for Thanksgiving, right? Because it's a battle between the head and the heart. The heart hasn't caught up to what the head knows. When we've integrated the death, our heart and our heads are in alignment. And so because grief can be so overwhelming and it affects us on those 5 realms, we can be surprised and we're not prepared. It really kind of throws us off. Well, you know, I'm an adult, I have a good job, I have a family, I have a good support system, I've got friends, I'm involved in the community. Why am I so affected by this death? I wasn't relying on them financially. You could also be experiencing confused feelings. Maybe that child inside of all of us might be feeling a sense of abandonment, even though intellectually you know that's not the case. When I'm counseling people, I'm very aware of the language they use. And there have been times I've experienced clients, not necessarily adults who have lost their parents, but in general, any type of grief, I hear things like, when they left me. And when the time's right, I explore that. What does that mean, when they left you? Because that's your perception, and that's going to influence your grief experience. So did your parents leave you? Do you have a sense of abandonment or being left behind? And no matter who that person was in your life, right? Whether they were parent by adoption or circumstance or biological, they were irreplaceable. We may have step-parents, but that one person who's died is irreplaceable. And so it should be that way. People are not interchangeable. And I think, again, we know that our parents aren't immortal. Our heads know that. But our hearts don't want to believe that. But they'll always be around. And it may shake up the family structure. Michelle, are you the eldest in the family?
No, Shelley is.
Oh, okay, I didn't meet you last time.
I'm number 2, number 3.
Okay.
My brother.
Okay. So all of a sudden, you've moved up a rank now, Shelley.
Yeah, Shelley.
Right? It's changing the family dynamics. But maybe Shelley doesn't want to take on that role. Are there expectations that the eldest sibling now take on that role? So now you have to renegotiate if you've got siblings. Who fills that spot? Can that spot be filled? What are the expectations? And that's naturally going to affect your identity, your role. So it's not just a matter of my mother or my father died, and I'm sad and I miss them. But how do we now figure out how to go on living without them? So if you think of a family system as parts of a mobile, and when all parts are there, it rotates and it moves and it functions smoothly. But if you take out one part, it's going to be off balance for a while. And so how do we all move while paying attention to our own grief needs, while doing self-care? How do we move? How do the parts move and adjust to the death and the absence of this person? And then there's other kinds of losses. Maybe a loss of a family home base. We've lost a link to our past. The person who could tell us about our past could give us historical data. And if you had a not so perfect relationship, then you're also grieving, or potentially you could be grieving what could have been, how it could have been better. And that's very legitimate. That's more symbolic loss. But now you won't get that chance if you were hoping for that. Once again, no matter how old we are, I think we rely on our parents to be there and say, good for you, congratulations. I'm proud of you. While we may not depend on it as adults, it's certainly nice to hear. And we've lost that chance also to learn from their experience and wisdom. You don't have to ask their permission whether to embark on an activity or an experience, but you might want to share that with them. Because this is the person who knew you really well from the beginning. And what about regrets, right? Regrets that you maybe never had that relationship. Maybe they couldn't give you everything that you needed or wanted or expected. And if your parent was ill, physically ill or mentally ill, and you were caregiving, then you became the parent. And they relied on you. And if you are part of that sandwich generation, I think you were talking about that, right? That you were talking about that, your children, right? Who had certain expectations for you ever since Grandpa, I take it? Grandpa died. Yeah, we're in that sandwich generation. We always feel like we're either caring for or worrying about or concerned about our parents, but we're still having to raise children. And then we forget about ourselves in the mix. We are still someone's children until our parents die, so their deaths mark our final passage into adulthood. Because basically that's saying time to grow up. You're the adult now. You've moved up a notch. You're the one who's going to have to be wise. Because where do you go? You're it. Maybe you don't feel you're ready for that. Maybe you didn't realize that. Because again, buried in our subconscious is our parents are going to be around forever. Who's an adult orphan here in the room? Who has lost both their parents? Oh. Had you heard that term before? Adult orphan? Yeah? No? Okay. My husband became an adult orphan about 22 years ago, 21 years ago, within 1 week of each other. He lost both his parents. Within 1 week, had nothing to do, like they were not in a car accident, they were not, from two completely different reasons. So within 1 week, he went to losing his mother to having lost his father. Kind of shook him, even as an adult. It's been described as a horrible emptiness, even if you've got other significant people in your life. They're the foundation, they're the roots. And when the second parent dies, the backup's gone. And there is no place to go home to. While it might be painful for you to go back to the family home when your first parent has died, there is still a sense of comfort and familiarity. But when both parents have died, where's home? Where's home? And when you lose your second parent, it most definitely can trigger your grief for the first parent. And that's general with any grief experience. So don't be alarmed that this grief experience that you're here for tonight might be triggering other grief experiences, other grief of people that were significant to you. Now, if it triggers it to the extent that it feels like it's just happening, that's a different situation. That might be a sign of unresolved grief on your part. But if you remember when mom died or when dad died, and it makes you sadder, that's normal. Because just think about happy memories. When you go away on a trip, remember that when we used to go away on trips, and you remember the last time we went away? So that's a very normal response. And yet we're not comfortable with it because this is a painful experience. So it will trigger other grief experiences. You may find yourself becoming jealous or resentful of friends and others who have both parents. You might have that experience after the death of your first parent. And once again, that's okay. And you don't have to hang on to it, but you do have to acknowledge it so that it doesn't hang around. Yeah, I'm a little jealous. I'm embarrassed to say I might be a little jealous that my friends still have their parents. That's okay, you're human. And then of course we're faced with our mortality if you're an adult orphan. And do you have death anxiety? Because we certainly don't talk about it freely in this society. And talking about it doesn't mean you're morbid. Talking about it and not necessarily just preparing for it from a practical perspective, while that's important, also emotionally. Adult orphan is a term that cannot be understood until it happens to you. It sounds like a cop-out or a pity party, but the grief is real. So don't internalize our culture's mourning avoiding messages. Please trust yourself. Don't trust your colleague, your neighbor. Trust how you feel and know that and if you're not sure, check it out with a professional. Is this okay? Is this normal? Am I having a pity party? But don't judge yourself, because that's putting additional stress on yourself. So if we don't do our mourning, then these are the things that could happen. These are the things that I might be looking at when I'm supporting somebody. Are these things getting worse? Is the jealousy getting worse? Is the anger intensifying? These are very important things, because now we're moving the needle over to mental health issues, possibly. And we don't want to get there. We don't want to get there at all. We don't want to think about, I don't want to be here anymore, or any kind of self-destructive behaviors. So at one time it was thought that in order to get through this process, we had to divest or withdraw all our energy from the deceased person. This was way back in Freud's time, and reinvest it in another relationship or a new interest. But recent research shows that that isn't healthy, and it isn't even desirable. Because when we've done our mourning, and when it's integrated into our lives as we move forward, as we live on, we develop what we call a continuing bond. How do we keep them alive? How do we keep their memories alive? The china, the green bean casserole, anything else that your family may choose. That's our continuing bond. So when you are through the storm, when you're holding on to run away, but you know you've got to do your painful work of mourning, the storm will eventually subside. The waves will get a little farther apart. They won't pull you under. You'll find your patience, your motivation, your energy, your interest in things slowly increasing. And hopefully you can find some meaning and create a continuing bond. But don't put the cart before the horse. You cannot push the fast forward button. So when you're ready, what did he or she do? How did they influence you? What did you learn from them? What did you learn not to do? Because they weren't perfect, right? They weren't perfect. I have a young lady who lost her partner and father of her 2 children, and I'm talking young. And her background, both her parents struggle with addiction. And she bounced around from home to home, and she's now living with her grandparents. And I said, what did you learn from your parents? And she started laughing. And she says, I learned what not to do. And I said, okay, tell me about that, because you seem to be a very good parent for your young age and for not having the experience. You seem to be an attentive parent. And she said, well, yeah, this is what I've learned not to do from my parents. And when they die, I'm sure she'll have to mourn and grieve and mourn them as well. So the very memories that are painful right now, please don't run away from them. Just like you have to embrace the pain that the memories bring, that's how you're going to get through it. Talk about them. Not force, but talk about them. As naturally as, yeah, she used to love this. Oh, we can't do that because he didn't like that. It's okay, it's not morbid. And teach other people in your life that it's okay to talk about them by talking about them. Give them an invitation. Because believe me, a lot of people say, I don't want to mention his or her name because I'm going to make them sad. Well, no, you might make them a little sadder, but they are sad. Just because they're not crying or isolating or angry doesn't mean they're not sad. What can you do to honor them? Maybe it is using the china every Thanksgiving and family occasion that you get together. Mom is there, but she's not there. But she's there in memory. Maybe you want to volunteer your time in memory of them. Whatever it is you choose to do. And remember that you can be grateful and sad at the same time. And I would challenge anybody in this room, if they say I don't have anything to be grateful for. Even if you have to force yourself. Even if you don't believe it. No, I am grateful. I'm grateful that I've got a roof over my head. I'm grateful that I had his or her love. I'm grateful I have a partner. I'm grateful I have a job. Some of those things may not hold as much meaning, but if you can at least verbalize it, it's telling me something. It's telling me that you can step outside of your sad for a moment and know there's still good in this world. And the very best thing you can do once you've gone through the storm of your grief is to go on and live fully in their memory. So that the sad isn't the focus of your life as you live on, but it's part of your life. It isn't something you're going to avoid or not talk about. It's something that you'll eventually share and talk about with a smile, maybe even laughter. And that's okay. Give yourself permission to laugh too in your grief. It's healthy. So I'm going to end with this. Our parents live on in the way we honor their impact on our lives, traditions, and family rituals. So to honor them is to live your best life once you've done your mourning. Thank you for coming out here. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are remotely. Any questions, any comments, anything you want me to review? What I'd like you to do is go out there and do your grief work and literally integrate what I've shared tonight into your grief journey and spread the word. Tell people it's okay. I have a right to feel what I'm feeling. And set the intention to get through this in a healthy way. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for coming out here. Thank you for mourning. And safe trip home, everyone. Good night.